Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at feminist perspectives on class and work from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So, pretty dense topic, but as a fellow philosopher, we both know how these concepts that might seem kind of separate women, work, and class, they're all actually super intertwined.
Yeah, totally. And what I think is really cool is how feminist philosophy doesn't just stop at like a simple economic analysis, We're going to be looking at how these issues like impact psychology, ethics, even getting into like postmodern thought.
I'm here for all of that.
Yeah.
Okay, so to even begin to understand all these different feminist perspectives, it seems like we kind of got to start with like that Marxist foundation, right? Like that's the bedrock.
Yeah, exactly. Marxism really stresses how important work is to like human nature. It shapes not just how we make a living, but like our entire understanding of ourselves. Like think about it, nomadic societies, then agrarian and now industrial. Every time the economic system changed, it actually like changed what it meant to be human.
That's such a good point. We just like take for granted what work even means. But it's really just like a product of where we are in history, right?
Sure.
So how does all this connect to women specifically?
Well, that's where Engels comes in. His work in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State argues that women's like social power totally changed with the whole rise of private property, the family, which used to be all about like producing stuff together, becomes totally separate under capitalism.
So instead of everybody working together, like
Yeah.
as a unit, we get this like public-private split, right? With men going off to work and women kind of stuck in the domestic sphere.
Exactly. Engels thought that even though capitalism gave women a chance at liberation, through being able to get wages, it also created new ways to oppress them. He saw the socialization of housework as like totally necessary for real equality, because otherwise women are always going to be stuck with that unpaid labor.
It's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Right. Capitalism says, hey, women, come join the workforce.
Mm.
But then it's like, oh, and also you're still responsible for all this stuff at home. And that tension is something that like every feminist thinker since has had to deal with. Now it's really important to remember that these categories like liberal, radical, Marxist feminism, they're helpful, but they're not perfect. Feminist thought is all about change. It's constantly evolving.
Right. It's not about like putting everyone into these little boxes.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of those early feminist thinkers. What were the first wave feminists saying about work and class?
Thinkers like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Emma Goldman, and Simone de Beauvoir, they all saw work and class as totally crucial for women's liberation. Gilman, with her whole public housekeeping idea, she argued that the skills women traditionally had could actually be used to like fix social problems, but she also saw motherhood as something that could hold women back.
It's interesting how even within that first wave, there were these debates about like the good and bad sides of traditional roles, right? So how did the second wave kind of build on those ideas?
The second wave really focused on housework as a form of oppression. Remember The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan? All that discontent among like middle-class housewives.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So many women felt totally trapped by those expectations of them.
Well, the second wave had different ways of looking at this problem. Liberal feminists thought that housework, because it was unpaid, made women financially dependent on men. But Marxist feminists went even further. They argued that housework either helped capitalism make more money or directly benefited men because their wives were doing all this unpaid labor.
And this is where it gets really interesting for us as philosophers, right? The second wave started questioning what work even means. If a mom is playing with your kid, is that work? How do we decide what's work and what's just like free time when it's not being paid for?
Totally. And that leads to even more questions. Should we be comparing unpaid work to the kind of work you get paid for? Or should we just get rid of work-based theories of oppression completely? Some people think we should focus on valuing care work as like a public good, recognizing how important it is to society.
It really makes us think about what we truly value,
Yeah.
and how our values are actually reflected in like our economic and social structures. It seems like the second wave really like opened up all these huge philosophical questions.
And when we talk about challenging assumptions, that brings us right to the public-private divide, that like separation between the home and the world of work and politics.
That's this invisible wall, right? Women are supposed to stay home, take care of the family, and men go out and do everything else. But feminists have argued that this divide isn't like natural, it's not inevitable, it's just something we made up to keep a certain power structure in place.
Exactly. It keeps women down by making sure they don't have as much access to resources, opportunities, even decision-making power. Think about the idea of the second shift. Even if a woman works a job, she still comes home to a whole other workday of housework and childcare.
Yeah, talk about burnout. And that connects right to the wage gap, right? Like, because women's work is seen as less important both inside and outside the home, women just constantly make less money than men.
Exactly. It's like society doesn't care as much about the skills and tasks that women usually do. Now, one solution people have talked about is comparable worth, looking at jobs based on how much skill and responsibility they need, no matter who usually does them.
So instead of just saying, oh, that's a woman's job, so it pays less,
Hmm.
we actually look at the value of the work itself.
Yeah.
It's about being fair and making things equal for everyone.
Exactly. But this whole gendered division of labor isn't just about money, It has a big impact on psychology and ethics, too. For example, psychoanalytic feminist theorists like Juliet Mitchell, Nancy Chodorow, and Sarah Ruddock looked at how mothering shapes men and women differently, like what kind of identities and skills they develop.
Because traditionally, mothering has been seen as a woman's job, right? So it plays a huge role in how we see ourselves and how we understand gender roles.
And that brings us to this really interesting debate in moral philosophy: ethics of care versus ethics of justice.
Okay, I'm listening. Break that down for me. How are they different?
Well, the traditional theories of ethics, the ones that usually come from those famous male philosophers, they tend to focus on like abstract principles of justice, individual rights, like a universal set of rules for morality.
So it's like this detached way of making ethical decisions.
You could say that, but the ethics of care, which is usually connected to feminist thinkers, focuses on relationships, empathy, and our responsibility to care for others. It's all about acknowledging that we're connected and making sure the people around us are doing okay.
So it's not just about following the rules, but about seeing the actual needs and vulnerabilities of other people, especially those we're close to. It's a more like contextual and relational way of looking at ethics.
Exactly. And even though these two approaches seem kind of opposite, they both point to a future where that rigid division of labor we talked about goes away. Both men and women will be able to do both care work and what we see as more masculine types of work.
So it's not that one approach is better than the other. It's about seeing the value in both and building a society that balances those perspectives.
Exactly. And Asha Bandari has built on this idea even more recently. She thinks we should expand traditional distributive justice theory to include caring considerations. She says caring shouldn't just be a personal virtue, but a basic principle of a just society.
That's a powerful idea, taking this concept of care and putting it at the center of how we organize society.
Yeah.
Seems like feminist philosophy is always challenging those old ways of thinking.
Absolutely. But we also got to remember that those early feminist theories, even though they were groundbreaking, sometimes overgeneralized, they didn't always consider how different women's experiences are across cultures, races, and classes.
Like they were trying to fit everyone into the same mold when actually women's lives are shaped by so many different things.
Exactly. And that's where those postmodern critiques come in, like from post-colonial and deconstructionist perspectives. Instead of making one big theory of women's oppression, we need to pay attention to the specific contexts and power dynamics in different situations.
It's a call for nuance and complexity, recognizing that there's no one woman's experience. And this is what leads to intersectional feminism, right? Understanding how all these different forms of oppression, sexism, racism, classism, homophobia, they all intersect and create unique challenges for different groups of women.
Exactly. When we talk about work and class intersectionality helps us see that a Black woman and a white woman might face completely different obstacles and opportunities, even if they have the same job. It reminds us that power dynamics have all these layers.
So we can't just talk about women like as one big group.
Right.
We have to consider all those intersections to understand how complex social inequality really is.
Exactly. And speaking of complexity, let's dive a little deeper into the concept of class. It's a tough one, especially in a place like the US where people don't really like to talk about class.
It's like this unspoken thing that affects so much of our lives, what resources we have, what opportunities we get, even our relationships, but we're not supposed to mention it.
But even when we don't talk about it directly, class is all around us. Think about empirical studies like Nickel and Dimed by Barbara Ehrenreich. She went undercover in low-wage jobs to show how hard it is for working-class women in America.
Or Diane Ree's work. She looked at how mothers from working-class backgrounds deal with their kids' education. It shows how class inequality still exists in our schools.
And Julie Buddy's research on how Latina high school students think about their own class, even if they don't use the word class. All this shows that even when we don't say it, class is a powerful force in women's lives.
It's like this undercurrent that affects everything, but we don't always see it. So how has feminist thought dealt with this idea of class? How do they see it connecting to gender and work?
Well, one interesting idea is Anne Ferguson's concept of sex class. She said that women's experiences of oppression, especially with work and family, cut across those traditional economic class lines. It's like a fourth category.
So even if a woman is rich, she can still be taken advantage of as a woman through unpaid housework or lower pay in jobs that are mostly done by women. It's like there's another layer of oppression that doesn't care about her economic status.
Exactly. And this connects to the idea of a feminist epistemological standpoint. It's not just that women have different experiences, but those experiences give them a special perspective on social reality, a perspective that can challenge the usual narratives and help us understand how power really works.
So knowledge isn't neutral, right? Where we are in society, our lived experiences affect how we see the world. And people who have been marginalized often have a clearer view of those systems of oppression.
Exactly. And this standpoint, this awareness comes from being politically active and working together with other women. But that leads to another question. With all the different experiences and interests women have, how can we find common ground to take political action?
Right, because like a wealthy CEO and a single mom working two minimum wage jobs are going to have very different needs and worries. How do we bridge that gap and create a movement that works for all women?
That's a challenge that feminist theorists have been thinking about for a long time. Maxine Molyneux, for example, talks about practical gender interests and strategic gender interests.
Okay, let's break those down. What's the difference?
Practical gender interests are things that come from women's traditional roles in the family, like having access to childcare, healthcare, and safe housing. They're about basic needs and taking care of their families, things that often line up with the economic needs of their families.
So those are the everyday practical concerns that affect women's lives and the well-being of their families.
Exactly. But strategic gender interests are about challenging male domination directly. They want to change the power structures that keep women down.
So things like reproductive rights, equal pay, and protection from violence, issues that go to the core of gender inequality.
Exactly. And these strategic interests can unite women across different classes, even if their practical needs are different. It's about understanding that the whole system needs to change for women to be truly free and equal.
It's about dismantling the systems of oppression, not just learning how to work within them.
Exactly. And Anna Dodi adds another layer to this with her idea of formal interests. She says that all women, no matter their individual needs and priorities, have a shared interest in having a collective political voice. It's about making sure women have the power to speak up for themselves no matter what they want to say.
So it's like saying, let's get a seat at the table first, and then we can figure out what we want to do. It's about solidarity and being empowered together, even if we have differences. Man, we've really covered a lot in this deep dive, huh? From Marx and Engels to all those different waves of feminism, the public-private divide, all the psychology and ethics of it, intersectionality, and like the whole mess of class and those different kinds of interests women have as a group. It's a lot to think about, even for like a philosopher, you know?
It really shows how much depth and complexity there is to feminist thought, doesn't it? There's no easy answer. It's not like one size fits all. It's all about constantly like questioning things and analyzing and pushing back against those systems that create and maintain inequality.
And what I'm noticing is this constant tension between like taking care of women's immediate needs, the stuff they need right now, and trying to make those bigger systemic changes.
Yeah.
It's like trying to balance those two things, making things better for women now, while also fighting for a future
Yeah,
where those very needs wouldn't even be holding them back, you know?
for sure. And feminist movements have always had to figure out how to deal with that tension. How do you balance those short-term goals with that vision of a truly just and equal society? It's a really tough question.
As a philosopher, this whole deep dive has given me like a ton of new things to think about.
Yeah.
What about you? What do you think is like the most important thing we talked about today?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there's no one feminist perspective on women, work, and class. You know, there are tons of different viewpoints, and sometimes they even disagree with each other. And that's actually good. It's through those debates that we learn more and come up with better strategies for social change.
It's like this constant evolution, feminist thought is always changing and adapting to new challenges and helping us understand gender and power in new ways.
Exactly. And that's where you come in as a philosopher. Your ability to think critically and analyze ethical issues and understand complex systems. Those skills are so valuable for navigating these debates and challenging assumptions and contributing to feminist theory as it continues to develop.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
It's really inspiring to think that philosophy can be a tool for social justice and making positive change.
So to leave you with one final thought to chew on, given everything we've talked about today, those historical shifts in women's roles, the ongoing challenges of economic and social inequality, and the constant evolution of feminist thought, What new kinds of activism and philosophical inquiry do we need to create a future that's actually just and equitable?
That's a big question, and I think it's one that we'll be wrestling with for a long time.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. It's been super enlightening.
The pleasure was all mine. Until next time.